It is June 26th, 2024, and this is Sermons on the Couch. Nicodemus here, and I just wanted to touch on a subject that I've been very aware of recently, and just when I look around, it seems like so many people are afflicted with something or going through something, and from the outside, it seems like it could easily be fixed, but it's just like there's so much suffering that's created by us, and I'm just like wondering what is it with the human condition and our journey that we have to stay in suffering so much, or that we choose to.
Yeah, you will. Obviously, that's an age-old question, and there's a couple of things we need to understand in answering it. And the first one is like, what is the suffering created? What does it come from? And obviously, I talk about Course in Miracles a lot, but I love to talk about the East and India, and whether it's Patanjali, the Yoga Sutras, and all fear is really a fear of death, and it's called the Vinavation in the Yoga Sutras. And in the East, them talking about like this idea of separation is where really the root cause of all suffering. You look at Buddha and leaving, as a prince, a noble, leaving the kingdom and really going in search of like, what is this I see? He saw someone suffering on the outskirts of the kingdom, and he came up with the noble truths: life is suffering. And in the East, in India, it's called samsara, right? The wheel of suffering. And there's basically this fundamental idea that the human experience and the human game is built on this idea of being separate. And the idea of separation is built on, this body, and we're born and we have this finite span of time. So naturally within that, there is this fear, because if you're finite, there's going to be fear there. So what Course in Miracles calls it is the only thing that needs to be corrected is this idea that somehow, that we all human beings have at some point, that we all experience at some point in this human game, is that we have very deep down this idea that fundamentally we can be separate from God or Source. And it's just not true. And actually, with what you're asking is why do people suffer, I want to go back to the Course for a moment. And I think that there's, I talk about this with students over the years a lot. There's two lessons in the Course in Miracles that are really apropos and speak into this. And it's lesson 79 and lesson 80. And there's a lesson every day for the whole year in the Course. Lesson 79 says, let me recognize the problem so it can be solved. So what you're asking is, you look around and like everybody seems to have their own problems. And I ask people this question all the time, and everybody looks at me like I'm crazy, is, well, what was 10 problems ago? Or like, what was your problem this day last year? Because you had one. And you probably treated that problem like that was like the big problem. So if you start to notice this, what you're going to notice is there's a part of your mind that's always attempting to have you be in problems. Now, the difficulty, what the Course says in lesson 79, it says, let me recognize the problem so it can be solved. What the Course says is that you and I, what our problem is that we actually don't know what our problem is. And that's what our problem is. So if you look at it, so there's like this endless list or endless string of problems that never gets solved. And even when you solve it, another one takes its place. And then I ask people all the time, like, when's the last time you were completely free of problems and at peace? I mean, I've asked that to like many successful, wealthy people that are powerful in the world and big in the world's eyes. Like, when's the last time you were completely free of problems and at peace? You know how many people have told me, like, I don't even remember. I can't even remember the time. I maybe when I was a kid. So think about that from in your question. There's a thief in our presence. There's a thief in our mind. And that thief, whether you call it, the Course calls it the ego, right? Ego edging God out. The ego is the voice of separation. Whether you call it the serpent, Satan, the opponent, whether you call it the Maya, right? The illusion, whatever you call it, that voice in your thoughts, in your mind, is always trying to convince you that separation from source is real. So you literally have an opponent within you, right? I remember somebody gave me a book one time. Satan, right? Satan in Christianity, Satan in Kabbalah means the opponent. So it's as though you're in a game with an opponent and you have no idea that you're up against this opponent. And this opponent's in your thoughts. So here's the thing. Lesson 79 in the course says, let me recognize the problem so it can be solved. That if the problem was solved, you wouldn't recognize that it was solved. Because if you don't know what the problem is, how would you recognize that it's already been solved? And this is the situation that all you and I and all human beings find themselves in. It says in the course is that you already have the answer, but you're still so uncertain about what the problem is that the ego, one of its mottos is seek but do not find. So it'll keep having you look over here, look over here, look over here, even though when you solve what seems to be the problem, another one takes its place and another one takes its place. And we never even question this. We just go through life and hopefully if I solve this one, this will be the one that'll end all of them. And you have people that it almost seems like they're sentenced to misery in their life. So, okay, what's the answer? It's really simple. The answer is God. Now, if I say that to people, and they look at me like, yeah, well what's the other answer? Because I can't pay my bills with God. Well, actually, you could. You just don't really believe that you could yet, but that's a whole other conversation. Because if God is my supply, then you can't believe God is my supply. All things work together for good because God has my back and I have, let's call it cosmic overdraft protection, right? You can't have that or believe that and be afraid at the same time. You can't. One cancels out the other. So going back now, lesson 80, the next day, the lesson is, the first lesson 79 is let me recognize my problem so it can be solved. Lesson 80 now is let me recognize my problems have been solved. So what the course says is if you would recognize your problems, you would recognize that you have no problems. Because the only problem in any situation ever is a belief in separation from God. The solution to that, quote, problem, and I put it in quotes because it's not really a problem. It's only a mistaken perception. So really simple. I'll give you an analogy. If you say, well, I walk outside and look, my shadow, I can't see the sun. Because when you're looking at your shadow, you're like, Chris, I can't see the sun, or Jim, I can't see the sun, or whoever your wife or husband is. You come back in like, I can't see the sun. They're like, well, why not? You're like, well, I'm looking at my shadow, and they, whoever it is you're talking to comes out and goes, well, you got to turn around to see the sun. And you go, well, yeah, but I'm looking at my shadow. Well, if you look at your shadow, you can't see the sun. And if you look at the sun, you can't see the shadow. Well, it's the same thing. You can't look at God and see fear, or look towards fear and make fear real and still see God. So ultimately, the correction is in our thoughts. So really simple, lesson 80 now is if you would recognize your problem, you recognize that you have no problems, that the fundamental problem has already been solved. The idea that you could be separated from God has already been solved. So actually, when we recognize that, we start to realize that we have no problems. Now you go, well, I have bills to pay and all this stuff in my life. Yeah, but why it troubles you is because of fear. So this really is a question between God and the ego, and which is going to be real for us. So if you start to, now it's about changing our mind and starting to train our mind to think with God, to think with abundance, to think with God as my supply, and to turn away from scarcity of all kinds, even though the world is constantly trying to tell you that scarcity is real and that's the way that life is. So how do we do this? This is the miracle process. It's a constantly learning to have our minds think with God and turn away from anything that tries to prove or teach us that separation is real. It's ultimately to recognize that you've already been given everything in creation. Nothing in this world can add to you, nothing can take away from you. You're already complete. Now you have to realize it in your own thoughts. And that's the game of life. And until you do it, you are sentenced to suffer. And when you do it, and the more that you develop that miracle mindedness, eventually suffering just doesn't even have a place to arise in your life. And that's the goal of really all human existence, is to realize that while we're in form, to experience that while we have this precious birth as a human being, to be able to realize this.